A frozen river cracks without warning. The ice does not announce weakness. It looks solid right up until the moment it decides it is not. A man can walk across it confidently, loudly, even proudly, and still vanish in a soundless instant, swallowed whole by something that never promised to hold him. The mistake is not arrogance. The mistake is assumption. The ice was never there for him. It was there for itself. Power works the same way in certain places, not because it is cruel, but because it is indifferent. It does not reward good intentions. It does not punish bad ones. It simply applies pressure until something gives. Those who survive mistake endurance for mastery. Those who vanish are quickly rewritten as lessons. In such landscapes, rulers are not leaders, they are consumables, chosen, used, and discarded by forces larger than their names. Ambition does not tame the land, it feeds it. And the land, patient and unimpressed, always collects its debt in full. This is not a story that begins with a family. It begins with an appetite. Russia was never a country in the conventional sense. It was a condition, an environment, a place where scale erases proportion and contradiction becomes normal. Winters long enough to erase memory. Summers violent enough to feel like an apology. Wealth so concentrated it becomes absurd theater, performed in rooms heated by the labor of people who freeze to death outside. Faith so intense it bends men into the floor, existing comfortably beside appetites so unrestrained they dissolve shame entirely. Russia did not balance these extremes. It stacked them. What emerged from that stacking was not stability, but pressure, the kind that demands release. In calmer places, institutions absorb that pressure. Laws diffuse it. Customs soften it. In Russia, pressure flowed upward. It climbed the hierarchy until it reached one body, one name, one figure who stood between chaos below and the idea of order above. That figure was expected to be everything at once: father, judge, general, priest, executioner. Mercy and terror packaged into a single silhouette. Moderate rulers did not fail here because they were weak. They failed because moderation itself was illegible. Compromise looked like surrender. Restraint looked like decay. Even competence could be mistaken for hesitation. The system did not reward precision. It rewarded mass, size, volume, excess. Russia did not ask to be governed. It asked to be embodied. That demand shaped every choice that followed. It explains why power in Russia never drifted gently from one hand to another. It snapped. It shattered. It left stains. The throne was not an inheritance. It was an exposed nerve. Touch it carefully, and you were ignored. Grip it tightly, and you might survive. Let go, and the shock killed you. Before the Romanovs, the nerve was bare. The old order had collapsed, not with ceremony, but with rot. Dynasties had names, but names mean nothing once belief drains out of them. When the previous line ended, it did not leave behind a vacancy. It left behind a wound. Authority vanished, and human behavior rushed in to fill the gap. Pretenders multiplied. Famine followed. Loyalty fragmented. The difference between survival and monstrosity disappeared. People did not rebel against power. They hunted it, impersonated it, wore it like stolen clothing until it was torn off again. The land itself seemed to participate. Harvest failed. Roads became traps. Distance became an enemy. Russia shrank and expanded at the same time. Its center hollowed out while its edges were chewed away by neighbors who sensed weakness like blood in water. There was no ideology left to defend, only exhaustion. Out of that exhaustion came a single collective decision. Not a vision, not a reform, a surrender. The ruling elite did not ask who should lead Russia. They asked what kind of person could survive being placed there long enough for everyone else to breathe again. The answer was not strength. Strength had memories attached to it. Strength had killed before. What they wanted was absence. Someone small enough to be filled, young enough to be shaped, fragile enough to be handled. The calculation was simple. A weak ruler could be managed. A strong one might remember what power felt like. So they chose a boy. He did not arrive as a conqueror or a reformer. He was extracted, summoned from hiding like an animal flushed from cover. When the crown reached him, it did not glitter. It hovered, heavy, final. He did not reach for it. He recoiled. His instinct was correct. He understood something the men offering it pretended not to. This was not an opportunity. It was exposure. What matters is not that he accepted. What matters is why. He was not persuaded by promises. He was crushed by inevitability. Refusal was framed as betrayal. Survival was recast as duty. Choice was removed carefully, politely, until obedience felt like the only remaining moral act. That process would become familiar. It would repeat with different faces for 3 centuries. The Romanov dynasty did not begin with confidence. It began with consent under duress. That origin mattered. It set the tone. This was not a family that seized Russia. It was a family placed in front of it like a shield held up by trembling hands, and the shield worked. For a while, the early Romanovs learned quickly what the land tolerated. Grand gestures invited backlash. Silence invited patience. Their greatest innovation was not policy, but duration. They stayed. They did not fall. They did not provoke the extremes they inherited. In Russia, this counted as genius. The throne became occupied again, and that alone changed everything. The chaos did not vanish, but it retreated. The land accepted the presence of a figure to push against. Pressure resumed its upward climb, as it always did, but now it had somewhere to go. The system inhaled. The wound scarred over, uneven and sensitive, but closed enough to function. From the outside, it looked unimpressive. No sweeping reforms, no dazzling victories. But inside Russia, memory is a political force. A generation grew up without seeing the state dissolve, without watching authority hunted through the streets, without tasting desperation as routine. That generation internalized a dangerous idea that the throne, simply by being occupied, was sacred, that emptiness was the true enemy, that any ruler was better than none. This belief would outlive every individual who benefited from it. It would justify brutality later. It would excuse failure. It would turn continuity into virtue and change into threat. The Romanovs did not invent this belief, but they perfected its utility. Russia had found a solution to its appetite. It would feed itself rulers, slowly at first, carefully, then with increasing speed. The land had learned that it did not need perfection. It needed availability. And the dynasty had learned something even more dangerous. That survival, once achieved, could be mistaken for control. The ice had not cracked yet, but it was already deciding where it would. The smoke had not cleared when they went looking for him. It never does after an apocalypse. Ash lingers, so does fear. What remained of Russia at the beginning of the 17th century was not a kingdom waiting for revival, but a landscape learning how to breathe again. The difference mattered. A kingdom looks for leadership. A landscape looks for shelter. Authority had evaporated. Not fallen, evaporated. The old ruling line had ended without ceremony, leaving behind no heir, no consensus, and no patience. Into that absence poured imagination. Men reinvented themselves overnight. Dead princes returned from the grave wearing borrowed faces. Loyalty shifted weekly. Power became something you could claim if you were desperate enough and armed long enough. The state stopped functioning and started hemorrhaging. This was the time of troubles, though the name is misleadingly polite. It was not trouble. It was collapse experienced at human scale. Crops failed. Winters lengthened. Food became rumor. People ate bark, then grass, then whatever else could be made to stop screaming stomachs. The social contract dissolved because contracts require faith, and faith starves faster than bodies. Moscow became a place where doors were barricaded, not against invaders, but against neighbors. Foreign armies noticed. They always do. The Polish crown did not knock. It moved in. Soldiers occupied the Kremlin itself, the symbolic heart of Russia, and treated it like a rental property. Swedish forces chewed through the north. The country was not under siege. It was being scavenged. Russia had become a body without reflexes. In that vacuum, the remaining elites gathered to do something extraordinary. They agreed. Agreement was rare enough to feel miraculous, but it was not principled. It was exhausted. The boyars did not suddenly discover unity. They discovered fear in common. Everyone in the room understood the same thing. This could not continue. If the throne remained empty, Russia would finish dying. If it was filled incorrectly, it might die faster. They had tried strength before. Strong rulers came with memories, executions, paranoia, secret police. A strong hand left bruises that lasted generations. The lesson drawn was not subtle. Power concentrated too confidently eventually turned inward. The state survived, but its caretakers did not. So they inverted the problem. Instead of asking who could dominate Russia, they asked who could endure it, who could sit long enough, quietly enough, to let the fever break. What they needed was not a builder or a warrior. They needed a placeholder with a pulse. Their solution was almost surgical in its cynicism. A boy, 16 years old, sickly, untrained, not even present. He was hiding with his mother in a monastery, which already disqualified him from ambition. He had blood ties to the old line, just close enough to feel legitimate, just distant enough to feel safe. Most importantly, he had no base, no faction, no following. He could not retaliate if controlled. They did not choose him because he was strong. They chose him because he was empty. When the delegation arrived, it did not look like destiny. It looked like a threat. The countryside they crossed was still scarred, villages half alive, roads unreliable. When they reached the monastery, they did not find a prince polishing dreams. They found a frightened adolescent and a mother who had learned exactly how Russia rewarded proximity to power. She refused them, not politely, not ceremonially. She spoke like someone who had watched too many sons die to language like duty and honor. The throne, she said, was a pit. Those who climbed into it were betrayed, poisoned, strangled, forgotten. She would not hand over her child to be consumed next. Icons watched as she listed names, dead rulers, dead families, broken promises. Her resistance was not ideological, it was maternal, and that made it dangerous. The boy echoed her fear. He did not posture, he wept. He said what every sane person would say in that moment. He was too young, too ignorant, too unfit. He did not know how to rule. He did not want to learn. He understood instinctively that competence would not save him. Only luck might. So they took luck off the table. The argument shifted. No longer about suitability, about inevitability. This was not an offer. It was an obligation. Refusal would not spare him. It would doom the country, and doom carries its own punishments. The pressure increased slowly, methodically, until resistance felt selfish, until survival itself felt immoral. Eventually, he agreed, not because he believed in destiny, but because he could not outlast the room. He accepted the crown the way prisoners accept sentences, quietly, without relief. He was taken to Moscow and crowned while the state around him still smelled faintly of smoke. The trick was that he was never meant to rule alone. The real architect of the dynasty was not present that day. His father was in captivity abroad, held by foreign powers who understood leverage when they saw it. When he returned years later, the shape of power changed. Formally, the son was the sovereign. In practice, authority doubled back on itself. Father and son ruled together. Church and state fused, not by doctrine, but by convenience. Decrees bore two names. Diplomats bowed twice. The boyars had wanted a puppet. They received a structure, an arrangement so tight it became untouchable. A ruler who looked weak but was protected by an institution that wrapped him in sanctity. To attack him was to attack order itself, and order was all anyone had left. This was the quiet brilliance of the arrangement. The son embodied continuity, the father enforced it. Together, they stabilized a country not by inspiring it, but by exhausting it. No purges, no grand visions, just persistence. The young Tsar did not conquer, he did not innovate, he did not dominate, he remained alive. In Russia at that moment, that was enough. The state healed not because it was cured, but because it was no longer bleeding out. Treaties pushed invaders back. Coin returned to circulation. Children grew up without learning how to identify cannibalism by sound. Memory softened. Trauma dulled. The absence of disaster began to feel like normality. And with that feeling came a belief far more dangerous than chaos, that the throne itself was medicine, that the identity of the ruler mattered less than the fact that someone sat there, that the country did not need greatness. It needed occupancy. This belief would calcify. It would justify endurance over improvement. It would turn fear of collapse into reverence for stagnation. The Romanovs did not argue for this idea. They demonstrated it by accident. The boy chosen to end the apocalypse did exactly that. He ended it by not becoming anything else. And in doing so, he taught Russia a rule it would never forget. That survival was proof enough that a ruler who did not provoke disaster could be forgiven almost anything, that the absence of collapse was indistinguishable from success. The land accepted this lesson eagerly. It always prefers a body to push against. The dynasty had been installed not as conquerors, but as shock absorbers. And shock absorbers, once trusted, are expected to fail quietly when the weight becomes too much. Stability arrived quietly, which is how it survives in places that remember noise. There were no banners announcing recovery, no ceremonies declaring renewal. The absence of catastrophe simply became noticeable. Markets reopened because they were not burning. Roads filled because they were no longer killing travelers. Authority returned not as confidence, but as habit. People learned cautiously that tomorrow would resemble today. In Russia, this counted as progress. The early Romanovs understood something their successors would repeatedly forget. In a traumatized system, motion is suspicious. Change looks like the beginning of another collapse. After years of impostors, invasions, and hunger, the population did not crave greatness. It craved repetition. The dynasty's task was not to inspire belief, but to dull memory. And dulling memory requires time. So they slowed everything down. The court became deliberately unremarkable. Power was exercised without flair. Decisions were incremental, often boring, sometimes indecisive. From the outside, it looked like weakness. From the inside, it felt like relief. The Romanovs did not announce themselves as saviors. They behaved like caretakers who did not trust their own tools. This restraint was not moral, it was strategic. Every extreme had recently proven lethal. A strong ruler invited fear. A reformer invited resistance. A visionary invited comparison to the men who had promised salvation and delivered starvation. The safest position was to appear necessary, but forgettable. to exist without reminding anyone how fragile existence still was. The state rebuilt itself around this philosophy, not through sweeping reforms, but through the careful reactivation of old mechanisms. Taxes were collected because collectors returned alive. Courts functioned because verdicts were predictable. Treaties held because promises were kept long enough to be remembered. None of this was impressive. All of it was effective. This period did not produce legends. It produced habits. And habits, once internalized, feel like natural law. The Romanovs learned to present authority as routine. The Tsar appeared regularly, prayed publicly, followed rituals precisely. He did not surprise anyone. He did not innovate. He performed continuity. In a culture obsessed with signs and symbols, this mattered. The message was subtle but constant. The center holds. The world has not ended again today. Behind this performance was a more complex reality. Power was still centralized. Violence still existed. Dissent was not encouraged. But these elements were deployed sparingly. The goal was not domination, but saturation. Authority became background noise, something people adjusted to rather than confronted. This was the dynasty's real achievement. It normalized itself. Over time, this normalization hardened into doctrine. The throne ceased to be a seat of judgment and became a fixture, like weather, something you prepared for, complained about, but did not imagine removing. The idea of an empty throne had become unthinkable, not because it was illegal, but because it was traumatic. Absence had become synonymous with disaster. This psychological shift was the Romanovs' most durable construction. Palaces crumble, laws change, beliefs endure. The early Tsars reinforced this belief by refusing to dramatize their own power. They avoided grand declarations. They rarely framed their rule as a project. The state was not going somewhere. It was staying somewhere. And staying after everything felt like mercy. This approach had consequences. By prioritizing stability over improvement, the Romanovs delayed necessary change. Institutions ossified. Inefficiencies accumulated. The state functioned, but it did not evolve. This was not accidental. Evolution risks fracture. Fracture risks memory. And memory risks panic. The Romanovs chose stagnation because stagnation was survivable. Their courts became conservative by instinct. Innovation was treated as disruption. Foreign ideas were filtered carefully, if at all. The outside world moved forward, but Russia paused. Not because it could not advance, but because advancing felt indistinguishable from unraveling. This pause created a strange tension. On one hand, the dynasty appeared legitimate. On the other, it became dependent on its own immobility. Stability was no longer a tactic. It was an identity. To change would be to admit that stability was insufficient, and insufficiency in Russia invites replacement. The Tsars learned to fear motion more than decay. This fear shaped their relationships with the elites. The boyars were managed, not transformed. Their privileges remained intact. Their power was checked quietly rather than challenged openly. The state needed them compliant, not loyal. Compliance could be purchased with predictability. The church was treated similarly. It was revered, integrated and regulated without confrontation. Faith was encouraged because it reinforced obedience. Schism was tolerated only insofar as it could be contained. The goal was not spiritual purity, but social glue. The population responded as populations do when fear recedes. They adapted. They rebuilt. They invested emotionally in continuity. Children born into this era did not remember cannibalism or foreign troops in the capital. They remembered processions, rituals, and the slow rhythm of a state that existed every morning. This generation internalized a critical assumption, that the czarity was permanent, that its flaws were preferable to its absence. that endurance itself was proof of legitimacy. The Romanovs did not teach this belief explicitly. They let time teach it for them. But stability is not neutral, it creates incentives. When survival becomes the primary metric, anything that threatens it becomes suspect. This logic begins to justify repression, not because repression is effective, but because disorder is terrifying. Better an unjust order than a just chaos. This reasoning would later become reflex. It would be invoked to crush reformers, silence critics, and delay adaptation. It would allow rulers to frame their own inadequacies as safeguards against catastrophe. For now, it remained implicit. The early Romanovs were not tyrants in the theatrical sense. They were caretakers, guarding a fragile system from shock. Their success lay in their refusal to be memorable. History barely notices them because they barely disturbed it. And yet their imprint was profound. They reset expectations. They taught Russia to equate survival with virtue, to forgive stagnation as prudence, to revere continuity as a moral good. This mindset created a paradox that would haunt the dynasty. By proving that a weak ruler could stabilize Russia, they also proved that strength was not required to hold power. But Russia's scale and contradictions do not stay quiet forever. Pressure accumulates. Demands return. Stability buys time. It does not solve problems. It stores them. The Romanovs were storing problems carefully. Each year of peace added weight. Each avoided reform added tension. The system became resilient to shock, but brittle under strain. When movement finally became unavoidable, it would not bend. It would snap. But that moment was still distant. For now, the dynasty basked in its most dangerous achievement, the illusion that endurance was enough. Russia had stopped bleeding. The patient was no longer dying, and so no one asked whether it was healing. They mistook the absence of collapse for health. And in doing so, they built a state that could survive almost anything except change. The ice had thickened. It looked solid again. And once more, people began to walk across it without listening for cracks. The quiet did not last. It never does. In Russia, stability is not an equilibrium. It is a compression chamber. Pressure accumulates invisibly until it finds a shape strong enough to rupture it. That shape arrived in the form of a man who did not fit the room he was born into. He was too large, too loud, too restless for a court trained to survive by minimizing itself. Even at rest, he looked like motion, a body that refused stillness, nearly 7 feet tall, twitching with nervous energy, towering over halls designed for men who bowed easily. He did not inherit Russia. He collided with it. From childhood, he treated the world as something to be assembled. While other princes learned prayers, he learned angles. While they memorized lineage, he memorized trajectories. His games were not symbolic. They were rehearsals. Dirt fortresses became blueprints. Toy regiments became laboratories. The future Russian army began as a child's obsession with order, imposed through noise and smoke. Then he saw the old system panic. The uprising came early, and it came close. Palace guards turned mob. Pikes rose. Bodies fell. Family members were dragged through doorways and reduced to components in front of a boy watching from a window. It was not a lesson in fear. It was a lesson in contempt. From that moment, the past stopped being sacred. It became suspect. He learned to hate what Russia had been long before he learned what it could become. The beards disgusted him. The rituals bored him. The endless chanting, the incense, the slow choreography of a medieval court felt less like tradition and more like decay, preserved through repetition. He saw a society fixated on symbols, while the world elsewhere was building machines, ships, guns, systems that moved faster than prayer. So he left. No Russian ruler had ever done that. Leaving implied curiosity, and curiosity implied dissatisfaction. He disguised it as diplomacy, But everyone knew better. A 7-foot Tsar does not travel incognito. He traveled openly, indifferently, collecting skills the way others collected titles. He went where things were made: shipyards, forges, workshops. He learned with his hands, hammered planks, set masts, drank with sailors, studied navies that could project force beyond rivers and myth. He did not admire Europe. He dissected it. When he returned, he did not bring ideas. He brought tools, and tools, unlike ideas, demand use. What followed was not reform. Reform implies negotiation. This was a seizure. Russia was taken apart by its ruler and reassembled without consent. He began with appearances, because appearances are the soft tissue of power. He attacked beards first, not because facial hair mattered, but because resistance did. He shaved men publicly, violently, sometimes drawing blood. The message was unmistakable. The old image of authority would be physically removed. Then he monetized humiliation. Pay to keep your beard. Buy proof of submission stamped in metal. Purchase permission to remain backward. It was not about revenue. It was about training an elite to internalize coercion as normal. Clothing followed. Time itself followed. Calendars shifted. Rituals recalibrated. He changed how Russia looked at the mirror and how it measured the day. Identity was not debated, it was overwritten. But culture was only the prelude. His obsession was force. Russia was landlocked, inward, slow. He wanted reach. He wanted water that did not freeze ambition in place. That meant war. He picked a fight with an empire that knew how to fight. The first encounter was a disaster. His new army disintegrated on contact. Discipline evaporated. Command failed. A humiliation so complete it should have ended his experiment. It did not. Failure energized him. He responded not by retreating from his vision, but by intensifying it. He needed guns. He had no bronze. So he melted the voice of God. Church bells were taken down and reforged into cannons. It was sacrilege made practical. Faith converted into firepower. He drafted peasants by ratio, lifers, men absorbed into the state until death. Families learned that sons were not raised. They were collected. The army became permanent because the state was permanent. Service was no longer episodic. It was structural. Years passed. The army hardened. When the enemy returned, confident, deep in Russian territory, the response was different. This time, the new system held. The battle was decisive. The old power collapsed. A new one announced itself without ceremony. Russia had become an empire. With victory secured, he turned to his most perverse creation, a capital that did not belong. He chose a swamp, a place hostile to life, cold, wet, diseased. And he ordered a city into existence. Tens of thousands were sent. Tools were scarce. Bodies were not. Men died where they fell and became part of the foundation. Bones stabilized what ideology could not. The city rose anyway. Elegant, European, artificial. It faced outward, toward a world he wanted to join, with its back turned deliberately on the country that built it. Then he forced the elite to move there, to abandon comfort, to finance their own exile. The new capital was not a gift. It was leverage. He could move people as easily as stone. But power that reshapes landscapes struggles with blood. His son was not a successor. He was a rejection, quiet, religious, drawn to the world being dismantled. Where the father saw rot, the son saw home. The conflict was existential. This was not a disagreement over policy. It was a referendum on the future. The father issued an ultimatum: adapt or disappear. The son fled, treason in its purest form. seeking protection from rivals. The response was surgical: promises of forgiveness, oaths sworn, then arrest, interrogation, torture. The father oversaw it personally, desperate not just to punish but to justify, to prove that the son was not merely inadequate, but dangerous. He died before execution. The cause mattered less than the lesson. Blood was expendable, even dynastic blood. The achievement that followed was immense: an army, a navy, a bureaucracy ranked by service rather than birth, academies, newspapers, standardized language. Russia was dragged, screaming, into a modern configuration. It now functioned efficiently. It could mobilize, tax, conscript, punish, and expand with frightening speed. But the paradox was complete. He had not freed Russia. He had optimized it. Serfdom was not abolished. It was industrialized. Autocracy was not challenged. It was perfected. The church was not humbled. It was absorbed. Everything independent was either broken or folded inward. Russia had gone from a medieval prison to a modern one. And in his final act of miscalculation, the man who controlled everything forgot the future. He rewrote succession to ensure flexibility, then failed to use it. When he died, exhausted, the machine he built had no instructions. Power sat exposed again, not because the system was weak, but because it was too centralized to function without him. The giant had reshaped the land, but he had not changed its appetite. Russia had learned what force could accomplish. It had not learned how to stop demanding it. The ice cracked differently now, stronger, thicker, more deceptive. And the dynasty, forged by a man who believed he could outbuild history, would spend the next 2 centuries discovering what happens when a system designed for giants is inherited by ordinary men. An empire built quickly never forgets what it was built from. The materials leave residues. They linger in habits, in assumptions, in the quiet arithmetic of power. When the giant was gone, what remained was not a nation grateful for transformation, but a machine that required constant feeding. Bells had been melted. Bones had been buried. The empire stood because it consumed. The first lesson of the new order was simple. Power no longer descended by blood alone. It moved through proximity to force. The army had been professionalized, but professionalism came with loyalty to paymasters, not principles. The guards were elite, drilled, armed and aware of their importance. They had been created to protect the throne. They quickly learned they could decide who sat on it. Succession ceased to be sacred. It became negotiable. The throne changed hands the way furniture does in a crowded room. Whoever could grip it, fastest kept it. The giant's widow was elevated not because she ruled, but because she survived him. Advisors ruled through her. Then she drank herself into irrelevance. A boy followed, then disease, then another relative. Each transition reinforced the same message. Authority was no longer inherited by inevitability. It was seized by convenience. This did not weaken the empire. It clarified it. The state did not collapse during these handovers because the system did not require legitimacy. It required obedience. Taxes were still collected. Regiments still marched. Orders still moved downward. The machine did not care who gave them, as long as someone did. The Romanov name became less important than the continuity of command. This period is often dismissed as decadent chaos. It was nothing of the sort. It was a laboratory. The empire was testing a dangerous hypothesis, that it could survive without coherence at the top, that personal weakness could be compensated for by institutional inertia. That power, once centralized thoroughly enough, no longer depended on competence. For a time, this seemed true. Behind the scenes, something darker solidified. The methods used by the giant were no longer exceptions. They were precedents. Coercion was normalized. Brutality was justified as efficiency. Resistance was treated as inefficiency. The state learned to speak the language of necessity fluently. Everything was done because it had to be done. No one asked why. The bells remained silent, not literally, but symbolically. The church had been absorbed so completely that dissent sounded like heresy rather than politics. Spiritual authority was bureaucratized. Faith was permitted, even encouraged, so long as it flowed upward. God had been nationalized. The city on the swamp flourished. Palaces rose. Canals reflected imported elegance. Foreign visitors were impressed. They saw marble and symmetry. They did not see the arithmetic beneath it. Each stone represented labor extracted without negotiation. Each facade hid an economy built on ownership of people. The city was beautiful because it did not belong to those who built it. The empire expanded outward while hardening inward. Borders moved, armies campaigned, maps were redrawn. Victory was measured in territory rather than cohesion. Expansion became proof of health. If the empire was growing, it must be functioning. This logic was comforting. It was also false. Growth masked fragility. The ruling class adapted quickly. They learned to survive not by serving, but by aligning. Loyalty became tactical. Marriage became infrastructure. Bedrooms replaced councils. Decisions were made in whispers rather than proclamations. The guards listened carefully. They learned which names mattered. In this environment, cynicism thrived. Idealism had no leverage. Reform was dangerous because it threatened predictability. Predictability was the only currency anyone trusted. The safest course was to leave structures intact and navigate within them. The empire rewarded those who understood this instinctively. What it punished were those who believed the rhetoric. The contradictions of the new Russia sharpened. It spoke the language of Europe while practicing the logic of feudal ownership. It fielded modern armies staffed by men who could not leave the land they farmed. It built academies while suppressing independent thought. Every advance carried a shadow. Every improvement required a sacrifice that would not be acknowledged. The bones did not vanish. They accumulated. Over time, the cost of maintaining the system increased, not financially, psychologically. The empire demanded constant performance. The appearance of strength had to be maintained even when it was hollow. Failure could not be admitted because admission implied vulnerability. Vulnerability invited replacement. This dynamic trained rulers to lie to themselves first. Those who sat on the throne after the giant were not tyrants by design. They were caretakers of an apparatus too large to question. They inherited rituals without understanding their purpose, commands without context, authority without intimacy. They learned to occupy power rather than exercise it. The empire did not require vision, it required presence. This created a dangerous illusion that the system was self-sustaining, that it could absorb mediocrity indefinitely, that the methods which had built it could maintain it forever. The Romanovs began to believe this. It was easier than confronting the truth. The truth was that the empire was metabolizing its own foundation. Serfdom intensified to support military needs. Tax burdens deepened. Local autonomy shrank. Dissent did not disappear. It went underground. Pressure did not dissipate. It accumulated. The bells had been melted once. The symbolism was never reversed. Sacred limits no longer existed. Everything could be repurposed. Everything could be sacrificed. This principle worked wonders when wielded by a giant. In the hands of lesser men, it became a blunt instrument. What had been an extraordinary act of will hardened into doctrine. Centralization was no longer a response to crisis. It was a habit. The empire continued to grow, but it grew brittle. Complexity increased. Flexibility decreased. The Romanovs mistook motion for progress, expansion for security, silence for consent. By the time a ruler emerged who could combine ambition with intellect, the system was already weighted. It rewarded force, but resisted guidance. It could be driven, but not steered. The empire built on bones and bells had achieved scale. It had not achieved balance, and balance in a land of extremes is the only thing that prevents collapse. The machine waited for someone to understand it. Instead, it would be inherited by those who believed they already did. Power does not disappear when legitimacy evaporates. It changes circulation. When belief drains out of a system, force learns to speak more clearly. After the giant's death, the empire did not ask who should rule. It watched who could remain standing long enough to be obeyed. The throne had been stripped of its oldest defense. Succession by blood had been weakened deliberately, then left unfinished. What remained was not chaos, but opportunity. The rules were unclear. The weapons were not. Guards mattered more than genealogies. Bedrooms mattered more than councils. Whoever could assemble momentum fastest became sovereign by default. This was not decadence. It was logistics. The elite adapted with impressive speed. They learned that survival required agility rather than loyalty. Oaths were temporary. Alliances were transactional. Morality was a luxury reserved for those far from the palace gates. In this environment, ideology was ornamental. Power moved through bodies, not principles. The first empress arrived by proximity rather than preparation. She had followed the giant through campaigns and corridors, absorbing authority without ever formalizing it. When he vanished, she remained. That was enough. Advisors ruled through her. The state continued to function because the machinery no longer required intelligence at the top. It required continuity of command. She provided a surface. Others supplied direction. Then she faded. Alcohol accomplished what rebellion did not. The throne passed again. A child followed. Then illness. Then another relative with sharper instincts and fewer scruples. Each transition reinforced a new norm. The crown was not earned. It was acquired. An acquisition depended on access to armed men who believed their futures were tied to yours. The guards became kingmakers not because they desired power, but because they understood leverage. They had been created to protect the throne. Now they protected their interests. They listened carefully to promises. They noticed who remembered names. They learned the difference between affection and attention. Attention mattered more. Women rose with startling frequency, not as a triumph of inclusion, but as a function of opportunity. They navigated the system effectively because the system rewarded intimacy. A ruler who could charm the right men at the right moments did not need institutional support. She needed timing. Bedrooms replaced battlefields. Whispers replaced decrees. The empire was not governed. It was managed through proximity. This arrangement did not weaken Russia. It insulated it. The state continued expanding. Armies marched, borders shifted, diplomats negotiated. From the outside, the empire appeared intact. From the inside, it had become hollowed. Decisions were no longer anchored to vision or fear of consequence. They were anchored to convenience. This was the era's defining trait. Convenience masquerading as stability. The court became a market. Favors were currency. Titles were incentives. Appointments were rewards for loyalty demonstrated in private rather than competence displayed in public. Governance became performative. The appearance of order was maintained because appearance was all that was required. The population noticed nothing. Or rather, they noticed everything and adapted. The distance between ruler and ruled was already absolute. Who occupied the throne mattered less than whether the tax collector arrived on time. The empire's size created insulation. Local life continued regardless of who wore the crown. This indifference was dangerous. It taught the ruling class that legitimacy was optional, that obedience could be extracted indefinitely through habit alone, That fear of collapse would prevent rebellion. For a while, they were correct, but habits cut both ways. The state learned to tolerate incompetence. It learned to absorb scandal. It learned to excuse excess. Each successful transition achieved through intrigue reinforced the belief that structure mattered more than substance. The Romanov name survived because the system did not require excellence to function. It required availability. Availability became the highest virtue. Those who ruled during this period were not visionaries. They were placeholders who understood the game. Their reigns were short, sometimes absurd, occasionally cruel. They humiliated courtiers for amusement. They imported favorites from abroad. They governed through impulse. None of this threatened the empire. It threatened dignity. Dignity in Russia had never been a prerequisite for power. What did threaten the empire was unpredictability. And unpredictability was managed through violence. Coups were bloodless when possible. Assassination remained a tool, not a scandal. The elite accepted this as the cost of order. Better a quick death in a bedroom than another decade of famine and impostors. The memory of collapse still ruled. This period clarified something essential. The Romanov dynasty had ceased to be a family. It had become a platform. Individuals passed through it. Some briefly, some disastrously. The platform remained because it had fused with the state itself. To remove it would require dismantling everything that depended on it. So the empire tolerated mediocrity. It tolerated cruelty. It tolerated ridicule. It tolerated rulers who could barely function. The only thing it would not tolerate was absence. Into this environment stepped a woman who understood the system not as it pretended to be, but as it was. She arrived without blood, without allies, without leverage, and she watched. She learned that power in Russia flowed along three channels: sanctity, sympathy, steel. She mastered each deliberately. She spoke the language. She embraced the church publicly. She flattered the guards privately. She read obsessively, not for pleasure but for instruction. While others treated the throne as a prize, she treated it as a mechanism. Her husband embodied everything the system could absorb, but not respect. He insulted its rituals. He admired its enemies. He played at war while real soldiers watched. His rule revealed the system's limits. The empire could tolerate incompetence. It could not tolerate contempt. That difference mattered. When the moment came, it came quickly. She moved with precision. She did not debate. She performed. Dressed as an officer, speaking in the language of loyalty and protection, she presented herself as continuity embodied. The guards responded instinctively, not to ideology, to familiarity. The coup was clean, bloodless, efficient. The former ruler collapsed under the weight of his own irrelevance. He signed away power as though relieved to be excused. What followed was inevitable. The system did not allow loose ends. The deposed husband died conveniently. Official explanations were crafted. They were ignored. No one asked questions because answers were unnecessary. The throne had been occupied again. That was all that mattered. The woman ruled next. Brilliantly, cynically, effectively. But her rise was the product of this era, not an exception to it. She did not break the pattern, she perfected it. The age of bayonet and bedroom had trained the empire to accept something profoundly corrosive. That power was transactional. That legitimacy was performative. That violence could be discreet and therefore forgivable. The Romanovs survived because they adapted to this logic. They learned to flow with it rather than resist it. Each successful seizure reinforced the belief that the system was resilient. It was resilient. But resilience is not immortality. What this era truly accomplished was the removal of myth. The throne was no longer sacred by inheritance. It was sacred by function. Whoever sat there became necessary the moment they did. This lesson would haunt the dynasty. It would allow extraordinary rulers to rise. It would also ensure that when the system finally failed, it would fail absolutely. Crowns had learned to move quickly. Soon, ideas would try to move faster. She understood the market immediately. Russia did not crave virtue. It craved reassurance. It wanted to be admired without being questioned, feared without being changed. Enlightenment, she realized, could be packaged like luxury goods, imported, displayed, never used. Her rise had been surgical, her consolidation theatrical. Once the crown settled, she did not rush to dismantle the system that elevated her. That would have been reckless. Instead, she refined it. Where others ruled through impulse, she ruled through presentation. She did not deny the empire's contradictions. She curated them. Abroad, she became an idea. At home, she became a fact. She wrote letters to philosophers who never smelled Russian winter. She quoted liberty to men who would never test it. She collected ideas the way she collected art, entire collections at once, purchased from failing European nobles, shipped east, arranged carefully in palaces built by people who could never enter them freely. Culture was not decoration. It was armor. Each painting was a credential. Each salon a signal. Russia, she insisted, was civilized now. Europe wanted to believe her. It was convenient. She spoke the language of reason fluently enough to be misunderstood. Her admirers heard reform. What she practiced was consolidation. Enlightenment was not a program. It was a veneer, and veneers are most useful when the structure beneath them is already rigid. At home, she made her real alliances. She rewarded loyalty extravagantly and publicly. Titles multiplied. Estates expanded. With them came people. Serfs detached from land, traded like furniture, gifted like jewelry. She transformed privilege into law. The charter of the nobility did not merely protect the elite. It liberated them from responsibility. They could own absolutely and answer to no one below them. This was not hypocrisy. It was calculation. The empire needed its elite comfortable. Comfort produces compliance. Compliance produces stability. Stability allowed her to perform enlightenment safely. Reform, after all, is disruptive. She had not survived her ascent to invite disruption. Her reign expanded the empire's borders decisively, southward toward warm water and old enemies. Territories fell with ceremonial inevitability. Crimea was absorbed not as conquest, but as fulfillment, a dream completed. The empire could now breathe year-round. Fleets could sail without permission from winter. She also helped erase a country. Poland was partitioned calmly, bureaucratically, divided like an inheritance among empires that agreed it was inconvenient to leave alive. Maps were redrawn. A nation vanished. Europe protested politely, then adjusted. This was power exercised without apology. Enlightened, orderly, final. At home, the cost accumulated quietly. The countryside did not read Voltaire. It read hunger. The more the nobility prospered, the tighter the chains became. Serfdom did not stagnate. It intensified. Ownership became cleaner, more explicit, more profitable. People learned their value the way livestock does, through transaction. Eventually, the contradiction demanded attention. It arrived disguised as resurrection. A man appeared claiming to be a dead Tsar returned. This was not unusual. Russia had a history of ghosts. What made this one dangerous was scale. He spoke to those who had nothing to lose. He promised restoration in a language they understood. Revenge, land, fire. The rebellion spread like a memory resurfacing. Cities fell. Estates burned. Nobles were killed publicly, theatrically, as if reenacting a suppressed chapter. Violence was not strategic. It was expressive. It was the countryside speaking after decades of silence. She responded instantly and without illusion. The enlightened empress disappeared. The Romanov autocrat took her place. Armies moved. Reprisals were exemplary. The rebel leader was displayed, caged, dismantled. The message was clear. Compassion was conditional. Order was not. When the smoke cleared, the lesson was absorbed. Reform invited expectation. Expectation invited revolt. Revolt invited annihilation. She would not repeat the experiment. From then on, her enlightenment became even more refined. Less practical, more aesthetic. Museums expanded, academies flourished. Foreign intellectuals praised her courage from a distance that ensured their safety. She smiled and continued. This was her greatest achievement. She taught the empire how to speak two languages simultaneously, one for export, one for use. The first spoke of rights, the second enforced hierarchy. The contradiction did not weaken her, it protected her. Anyone who criticized her practices was accused of misunderstanding her ideals. Anyone who pushed her ideals too far was accused of threatening order. The mask worked because it was beautifully crafted. By the time she died, she had secured everything that mattered: territory, prestige, continuity. The empire was larger, richer, and more admired than ever. The nobility adored her. Europe respected her. The throne was unchallenged. What she left behind was more complicated. She had flirted publicly with ideas that could not be unlearned: liberty, equality, rational governance. She had introduced them as conversation pieces, not instructions. But ideas do not respect intention. They wait, they migrate, they adapt. Her own son was evidence of this danger. He absorbed the structure without the performance. He inherited authority without illusion. His reign was short and paranoid. He was removed violently. The cycle resumed, but the damage had been done. She had sold Russia a dream it could not fulfill, and a reality it could not escape. The elite learned to talk like philosophers and act like landlords. The educated learned to read promises and notice their absence. The state learned that repression was safer than explanation. Her reign was remembered as golden. That was deliberate. Gold reflects light. It hides cracks. The empire she handed over was strong, admired, and structurally compromised. It had perfected the art of appearing modern while remaining immobile. It had expanded its borders while tightening its core. It had normalized a lie so elegant that even its beneficiaries believed it. She had not betrayed enlightenment. She had demonstrated its utility as camouflage. The Romanovs emerged from her reign more confident than ever. They had conquered land. They had conquered image. They believed they could manage contradiction indefinitely. They were wrong. The ideas she treated as accessories would soon demand ownership. The people she treated as inventory would soon count themselves. The mask would slip, not because it was poorly made, but because history eventually demands coherence. And when it did, the empire would discover that selling enlightenment without delivering it does not delay reckoning, it compounds it. He inherited victory like a curse. Salvation arrived wrapped in guilt, and triumph tasted faintly of murder. From the moment the crown settled on his head, it pressed downward with the weight of a man strangled in a dark room. Power had been transferred efficiently, discreetly, and unforgivably. The empire called it continuity. He called it memory. He was handsome in the careful way that suggests distance rather than warmth. Polished, articulate, admired without being understood. Diplomats loved him because he reflected what they wanted to see. Courtiers trusted him because he seemed unsure. Both instincts were mistakes. Uncertainty in Russia is not weakness, it is incubation. He had consented to his father's removal, not enthusiastically, not directly, but enough. He told himself it was necessity. He told himself it was mercy. He told himself anything that allowed sleep. None of it worked. The blood remained. This guilt shaped him more reliably than ideology ever could. He began as a reformer because reform felt like absolution. He surrounded himself with young men who spoke of constitutions and limits and futures that did not require strangulation. They whispered of emancipation as if it were prayer. He listened. He believed. For a moment, the empire exhaled. Censorship loosened. Prison doors opened. The language of possibility returned. It felt fragile, but real. The Romanov system had learned to wear masks. This one was different. It trembled. Then Europe intruded. Across the continent, another man was reorganizing power with artillery and ambition. He came from nothing and moved like inevitability. Where the Russian ruler hesitated, this one advanced. Where guilt restrained, confidence accelerated. Their collision was inevitable. The first encounter was humiliating. The Russian army fought bravely and was dismantled efficiently. The defeat was personal. He watched his forces dissolve under the gaze of a man who understood warfare as physics rather than tradition. It was not simply a loss, it was exposure. And then something unexpected happened. The two rulers met not as enemies, but as reflections. On a raft anchored between borders, they spoke for hours. They admired each other openly. They imagined a world divided rationally, like property, east and west, influence neatly assigned. It was a fantasy shared by men who believed themselves exceptions to history. For a while it worked, but admiration decays faster than fear. Economic pressure mounted. Respect thinned. The Western conqueror did not see an equal. He saw a partner who hesitated too often. When invasion came, it arrived with mathematical confidence. The response was not brilliance, it was patience weaponized. The empire retreated. Villages burned themselves. Fields erased their own usefulness. Distance became a defense. The land swallowed armies politely, without drama. When battle finally came, it was apocalyptic. Men died until the concept of victory lost meaning. Then the capital burned. The order did not come from rage. It came from clarity. Better ashes than surrender. Better emptiness than occupation. The city sacrificed itself, so the idea of submission would not survive. The conqueror waited in ruins for a peace that never arrived. Winter completed the argument. What marched out of Russia was not an army. It was a memory of one. Victory arrived without ceremony, and with it, transformation. He emerged changed, not empowered, consecrated. He believed he had been chosen, that his survival and triumph were signs of forgiveness, that God had weighed his sin and found utility in it. He marched into the heart of Europe not as a conqueror, but as a judge, the savior of order, the restorer of thrones. Paris fell quietly. This was the apex, a Russian emperor dictating terms to Europe. The Romanov dynasty stood taller than ever, and yet something essential inverted. The reformer vanished. The zealot remained. He no longer trusted ideas. He feared them. He had seen what uncontrolled ambition could do when fueled by principle. Revolution was no longer a theory. It was a contagion. He created alliances not to build peace, but to freeze movement, to suppress change wherever it appeared. Abroad, he crushed revolutions. At home, he delayed reform indefinitely. He granted constitutions to others as experiments. Russia remained excluded. He feared what freedom might unlock within his own borders. He feared it because he recognized its power. The guilt never left. It mutated. He withdrew into mysticism. Prophecy replaced policy. Fasting replaced debate. He spoke less, listened to omens, considered disappearance. When he died far from the capital, rumors bloomed immediately, perhaps too immediately. The body returned sealed. The mother did not recognize it. Stories spread of a holy wanderer in Siberia who spoke like a general and prayed like a penitent. The empire did not investigate deeply. Mystery was preferable to certainty. Then the problem emerged. He had left no clear successor. The rules were known. The renunciation was not. Brothers swore loyalty to each other across borders. Weeks passed without authority. The throne sat empty again. And emptiness in Russia is not neutral. It attracts belief. Young officers stepped forward, educated, idealistic. They had marched through Europe and inhaled possibility. They saw the pause as opportunity. They imagined transformation could be announced, not enforced. They gathered in the cold. They shouted confused slogans. They waited for momentum. They received artillery. The new ruler did not hesitate. He had watched hesitation destroy his brother. He fired into his own soldiers without ceremony. The rebellion ended in minutes. Executions followed. Exile followed. Silence followed. The lesson was immediate and permanent. This reign began with blood and chose iron. Reform had flirted with catastrophe. It would not be repeated. The empire sealed itself. Thought became suspect. Obedience became ideology. The state transformed into a barracks administered by an engineer who believed precision could replace trust. The savior's guilt had produced a jailer. This was the inheritance he left. A system convinced that openness invited invasion, that flexibility invited collapse, that only rigidity preserved survival. It worked briefly. It also ensured stagnation. The Romanovs had survived another crisis. They had crushed another alternative. They believed the pattern had been proven. They had not noticed that the cost of survival was accelerating. Guilt had saved the empire. Fear would maintain it. For a time, he did not inherit a throne. He inherited a warning. The first sound of his reign was artillery, fired into frozen ranks of men who believed ideas could substitute for obedience. That sound never faded. It became doctrine. Where his predecessor hesitated, he calculated. Where others balanced, he aligned. His body reflected his philosophy. Tall, rigid, engineered rather than grown. He stood like a regulation given human form. There was no softness to negotiate with, no curiosity to misinterpret. He did not wonder what Russia could become. He decided what it must not. His worldview was brutally efficient. Russia was not a society. It was a structure. Structures collapse when stressed improperly. Therefore, stress had to be eliminated at the source. Ideas were stress. Dissent was vibration. Reform was corrosion. He would freeze everything. He announced a trinity that explained the universe with bureaucratic elegance: autocracy, orthodoxy, nationality. Not principles, instructions. Autocracy meant the ruler's will was not a preference, but a physical law. Orthodoxy meant belief flowed downward, sanctioned, purified, monitored. Nationality meant identity was singular, mystical, and incompatible with deviation. Together they formed a closed system. Nothing entered that was not approved. Nothing exited without consequence. To enforce this, he built something more enduring than monuments. He built a climate. The secret police were not merely watchers. They were curators of reality. Letters were opened, conversations cataloged, thoughts inferred. Universities became monitored spaces where curiosity itself required justification. Censorship was not about preventing rebellion. It was about preventing imagination. A society that cannot imagine alternatives does not demand them. Absurdity followed naturally. Words became dangerous, independent of meaning. Medical texts were censored for using the term revolution. Children's stories were altered because clever animals suggested hierarchy could be questioned. The state began fighting metaphors. It took this seriously. Writers learned to encode. Philosophers learned silence. The most talented learned exile, or madness. A great culture learned to speak sideways. Genius survived, but it hid. Outwardly, the empire appeared formidable. Parades marched flawlessly. Uniforms were immaculate. Bureaucracy expanded into every crevice of life. Regulations multiplied until compliance itself became exhausting. The ruler believed this was strength. It was order made visible. Europe watched with confusion and relief. Revolutions burned across the continent. Thrones fell. Barricades rose. Russia stood untouched. He sent armies west not to conquer, but to extinguish. He crushed uprisings for others, acting as custodian of decay. Monarchs praised him. Reformers cursed him. He considered both responses. Confirmation. He believed history had been mastered. What he did not see was time accelerating elsewhere. While he inspected parade lines, factories multiplied beyond his borders. Steam replaced muscle. Rifles replaced tradition. Railways rewired strategy. Warfare evolved quietly. His army remained vast, loyal, and obsolete. It was composed of men bound to land they could not leave, commanded by officers who inherited authority rather than earned competence. The system looked invincible until it was tested. The test came from the south, disguised as diplomacy and faith. It became a war that exposed every assumption he had frozen into place. Supply lines collapsed. Communication failed. Technology lagged. The empire fought the future with the past and lost publicly. Heroism could not compensate for structure. Courage did not substitute for logistics. The fortress state cracked. He could not accept it. He blamed weather. He blamed subordinates. He blamed fate. He did not blame the system because the system was him. Acknowledging failure would require thawing. Thawing risked collapse. So he refused. Illness arrived conveniently. He rejected treatment. Withdrawal masqueraded as stoicism. He died convinced that order had been preserved, unaware that the ground beneath him had already softened. His final words admitted what his reign could not fix. He left a command in ruin. The inheritance passed to a man who understood what defeat meant. The ice began to melt. But melting is not gentle. Frozen systems do not transition. They fracture. The Iron Tsar had succeeded brilliantly at his task. He had stopped history, temporarily. He had preserved autocracy by isolating it from reality. He had made reform synonymous with chaos. He had also guaranteed that when change finally arrived, it would not arrive politely. It would arrive like heat meeting steel. He opened the windows because the walls were already cracking. The smell of defeat had seeped into every corridor, and even the most loyal noses could detect it. The empire did not need vision. It needed triage. He was not a dreamer. That was his advantage. Raised by iron, trained by failure, he understood a single brutal equation. Change was no longer optional. It was tactical. Reform was not a gift to the people. It was a concession to gravity. The foundation was rotten, and everyone knew its name. Serfdom had survived faith, conquest, enlightenment, and fear. It had survived because it was useful. It fed armies. It filled treasuries. It enforced obedience without ideology. But it had also fossilized the state. An empire trying to fight modern wars with medieval labor eventually discovers the limits of nostalgia. He did not speak of morality. He spoke of survival. When he announced emancipation, bells rang reflexively, as if celebrating something noble. The language was generous, the symbolism impeccable. Millions were declared free in a single gesture. A broad applause followed. At home, silence. Then the paperwork arrived. Freedom was not given, it was sold. The land the peasants had worked for generations was not theirs by right. It was inventory. They would buy it back slowly, painfully, over decades. The state paid the nobles. The peasants paid the state. Interest accumulated like habit. Liberation became a mortgage that would outlive those it burdened. They were free to owe. The village commune replaced the estate as the instrument of control. Collective responsibility ensured no one could leave without permission. Debt bound them more effectively than chains. The empire had removed the word slavery while preserving its function. The reforms satisfied no one. The nobility resented losing absolute ownership. The peasants resented gaining conditional existence. The ruler discovered he had managed the impossible. He had united the country in disappointment. This disappointment did not dissipate. It educated. A new class emerged not from wealth, but from exposure. Sons of priests, clerks, minor officials, educated enough to see contradiction, powerless enough to resent it. They read the reforms closely and noticed the trap. They concluded something dangerous. The system could not be fixed incrementally. It had to be destroyed completely. They believed in nothing because belief had betrayed them. They organized patiently, quietly. They replaced discussion with discipline. Cells replaced salons. Idealism hardened into resolve. The ruler became not a liberator, but an obstacle. If the arch was to fall, the keystone had to be removed. What followed was relentless. Explosions missed their targets by chance. Trains survived by miscalculation. Palaces shook. The ruler lived in transit, protected by schedules that changed daily. Guards multiplied. Walls thickened. The state hunted shadows and found symbols instead. Then one afternoon, routine won. The carriage was reinforced. The first blast failed. He stepped out instinctively to assess damage. That instinct was his inheritance. It killed him. The second explosion was precise, public, final. The man who had freed millions died disassembled on a street he had governed. His blood soaked into the same snow that had once held promises. The irony was not subtle, it was deliberate. On his desk lay a document he would never sign. A proposal, timid, limited, too late. The future he had postponed had arrived violently. His son watched him die and learned the only lesson blood ever teaches effectively. Reform invites murder. Mercy invites annihilation. He chose certainty. Freedom had been delivered, but as debt. Reform had been attempted, but enforced with terror. The result was neither stability nor progress. It was acceleration. The empire had crossed a threshold. It could no longer pretend that controlled change was possible. Every concession created appetite. Every delay radicalized opposition. The system began producing enemies faster than it could eliminate them. The Romanovs had tried to vent pressure carefully. They discovered pressure prefers rupture. The ground shook again. The pendulum did not slow. It snapped back. The man who inherited the blood did not ask why it had spilled. He asked how to prevent it from happening again. The answer came easily because it had already been written by his grandfather in iron letters. Reform kills. Doubt kills. Openness kills. The empire does not survive negotiation. It survives fear. He was built like a fortress and thought like one. Broad, immovable, convinced that history could be subdued through posture alone. He announced that the experiment was over. The future had been tested and found murderous. The past would be restored, purified, intensified. Documents were torn, promises withdrawn. Autocracy was declared unshakable not as tradition, but as emergency protocol. The secret police were reborn sharper, quieter, more methodical. Surveillance ceased to be reactive. It became preventative. The state no longer waited for threats. It imagined them. Culture was compressed. Universities were disciplined. Minorities were reminded where the margins were. Loyalty was measured not by action, but by silence. This was not chaos. It was order applied without apology. And it worked. There were no major wars, no great revolts. The empire grew richer, heavier, more confident. Railways spread. Industry expanded. The ruler boasted that Russia had only two allies, army and navy. He trusted them because they were simple. They did not argue. When he died unexpectedly, the system did not crack. It transferred smoothly to his son. That smoothness was the illusion. The son was not built for this inheritance. He was polite, educated, earnest, a man who believed decency could substitute for authority. He loved his family. He hated confrontation. He mistook stubbornness for principle and hesitation for prudence. He believed in the old formula without understanding why it had been written. Absolute power, divinely granted, unquestionable. He believed it because he had been told to, not because he could enforce it. The world he inherited was no longer frozen. It was thawing violently. Factories were creating crowds. Cities were filling with hunger and ideas. The countryside was still drowning in debt. The old controls remained, but the population had changed. The illusion collapsed early. His coronation celebration turned into a stampede. Gifts scattered across a field that became a grave. Hundreds died before his reign had begun. That night he attended a ball. Courtesy demanded it. The dead could wait. They never forgave him. The name followed him quietly. Bloody. Not because he enjoyed violence, but because he could not see it until it was too late. He sought distraction through war, a short one, a victorious one. It failed spectacularly. The empire discovered that size without competence is an invitation to humiliation. Defeat abroad ignited memory at home. The people marched peacefully, carrying icons, singing hymns, believing the myth their ancestors had believed, that the ruler was a father who had simply been misinformed. Soldiers fired into them without warning. The myth died in the snow. He conceded under pressure. He signed promises he despised. A parliament appeared briefly, then was hollowed, dissolved, neutered. He had learned nothing. He was waiting for democracy to tire itself out. Then fate intervened personally. A son was born and immediately marked for death by inheritance. Blood that would not clot. Panic that would not subside. Medicine failed. Faith replaced it. A peasant mystic arrived and succeeded where doctors could not. That was enough. The ruler surrendered judgment to his wife. His wife surrendered reason to a miracle worker. The state surrendered coherence to superstition. Appointments followed visions. Policy followed prayer. The empire watched in disbelief as power leaked into the hands of a man who understood nothing except leverage. Scandal rotted confidence. Trust evaporated. Laughter turned cruel. But the ruler remained loyal to his family. That loyalty would define his end. When the Great War came, he stepped forward, believing presence equaled leadership. He took command and owned every defeat personally. He left the capital to those least capable of governing it. Hunger returned. Patience ended. Revolution did not arrive with speeches. It arrived with empty bakeries. Soldiers refused orders. Regiments turned their guns. The final pillar cracked. The ruler abdicated quietly, exhausted, concerned only for his sick child. The dynasty ended not with defiance, but with relief. The nice man had failed because the system required giants, and giants were gone. The fall was administrative. That is what makes it unbearable. There was no last stand, no banner carried into flame, no operatic collapse worthy of 3 centuries of domination. The crown did not shatter. It was set down carefully on a table in a railway car and left behind like luggage no one wanted to claim. Power moved on without ceremony. History did not pause. The former ruler became a logistical problem. At first, he was protected, not out of loyalty, but caution. He was moved east, away from crowds that still remembered what icons were supposed to mean. Guards replaced courtiers. Routine replaced ritual. The family adapted quickly because they had already been living inside a shrinking world. Palaces had become cages long before walls were locked. They waited. The provisional regime that inherited the vacuum spoke the language of moderation. It promised order, reform, continuation. It kept the war going. It delayed decisions. It tried to govern a collapsing empire through committee. That hesitation was fatal. Power abhors uncertainty more than cruelty. The next regime did not hesitate. When the radicals arrived, they understood something the moderates did not. Symbols matter only while they breathe. A living dynasty, even imprisoned, is a rallying point. An executed one is a lesson. The family was moved again, deeper, further from negotiation, to a city that existed only because industry required it. They were placed in a house renamed with bureaucratic irony, a house of special purpose. It did not need explanation. Their days contracted, reading, walking, simple routines. The former ruler chopped wood for exercise. The empress prayed. The children staged small plays. It was not dignified, but it was human. For the first time, the dynasty existed without spectacle. That was unforgivable. The Civil War advanced. Armies shifted. Rescue became a possibility. Possibility became urgency. Orders were sent, carefully worded, ambiguous enough to deny later, clear enough to execute. They were woken after midnight, told it was for their safety. That shooting had been heard, that they needed to move. They dressed without protest. Habit is powerful. Authority had trained them well. They were led downstairs into a small room. Chairs were brought. One more requested. Granted. Even at the end, procedure mattered. The sentence was read flatly. No flourish, no sermon. The former ruler had time to register confusion, not fear, confusion. He turned instinctively toward his family. That reflex outlived the empire. The first shot ended the dynasty in principle. The rest was mechanics. Bullets ricocheted. Smoke filled the room. Screams cut through orders. What followed was not an execution. It was a failure of planning colliding with excess. The daughters did not die quickly. Wealth sewn into clothing deflected rounds. The empire's final inheritance became armor against its conclusion. It did not save them. When it was over, bodies were removed, burned, buried, disguised, erased. Records were falsified, silence imposed. The state moved on immediately because that is what states do. The cellar was cleaned. What survived was not the family. What survived was the pattern. The Romanovs had trained a civilization to believe that only absolute power could govern vastness. They had proven it repeatedly by surviving crises that would have shattered looser systems. They had also proven the cost. Every reform delayed. Every contradiction preserved. Every problem solved with force rather than adjustment. When the dynasty fell, the throne did not disappear. It changed costume. The men who ordered the execution did not rule like administrators. They ruled like autocrats. They centralized power. They crushed dissent. They demanded obedience. They used ideology instead of divinity, but the structure was familiar. The whip had changed hands, not purpose. The system endured because it had been normalized. This was the final Romanov legacy. Not palaces, not jewels, not tragedy. Training. 3 centuries of instruction in how power behaves when unchecked, how it justifies itself, how it survives by becoming indispensable. The cellar was not an ending. It was a handover. Names changed. Symbols changed. Methods remained. History did not reverse. It continued forward along the grooves already carved. The Romanovs had believed they were exceptional. They were not. They were exemplary. They demonstrated the rule. In a land of extremes, moderation is temporary. Reform is dangerous. And power, once concentrated absolutely, does not vanish when a family dies. It waits.